Here's my game of the day from round 4 of the Biel Grandmaster Tournament 2017. And I'm looking at the encounter between Harikrishna with white against the Swiss Grandmaster Noel Studer. And I thought this game was particularly interesting because Studer is playing a system that I've played a few times with black. The French advance, not the French advanced variation, the French classical variation with knight f6, and this tempts white forward, and Harikrishna did indeed go forward. Of course, one can play bishop g5 there, it leads to other variations, but e5, and we have this typical locked French pawn structure. And that means that black is able to counter-attack this point in the center, d4. So there's tension there. d4 is a critical point. But also sometimes white can try to break with f5 to get some initiative on the king side. So already there's quite a double-edged position on the board. So bishop e3, supporting the d4 pawn. And this is really the starting point of this entire variation, and there are so many different ways for black to play this position. You can just trade lots of pieces on d4 and play bishop c5. Bishop e7 is a variation that I analysed on one of my recent DVDs on the French as one of my recommendation. But I've also played the move that Studer plays, and that's a6, with the idea of advancing these pawns on the queen side and setting up this nice queenside initiative. And now b5. So sometimes white castles queenside. In this particular position it would be a disaster, because then black would lock the center, and this is just a crushing pawn roller on the queen side. I mean, there are so many different moves here for white. Exchanging on c5 is very popular. You can also play pawn to a3. You can play bishop e2. You can even play bishop e3. You can drop the knight back to e2. I mean, so many moves available. Harikrishna played knight d1 very quickly. And he clearly prepared this because Studer, well, as Studer said afterwards, he's played the French defence his entire life. And in fact, there's something very specific that Harikrishna had aimed at in his preparation. Point of knight d1 is to be able to support the pawn on d4 with c3. It also preempts a strike with b4, and the knight often reroutes itself to f2. So, well, a sensible move. Now, how should black proceed? Well, Studer played queen b6, which is how he played before. There was a recent game from the European Individual Championship in Minsk that went pawn takes d4, and black exchanged and played bishop c5. And this is a much calmer way of playing the position. This was in the game between Peter Lecko, playing white, and Rasmus Svaner, who's a very promising young German player. And I think you could say that white is slightly more comfortable here, but after a move like b4, well, black has a very typical position. It's difficult for white to advance on the king side when black has, decent pressure on the centre and play on the queen side. But queen b6 holds more tension in the position, and is very typical of Studer's playing style. He's not afraid to really go for his opponent and to play the sharpest move. And this is definitely sharp because, yeah, it keeps the tension. You notice this bishop is still at home on f8, for example, compared to the game we just looked at. But Studer is a very diligent player, and he does his homework well. So it's interesting to see what he'd prepared. So a5. So black still wants to advance on the queen side and maybe play the bishop to a6. There we go. So this is a really uncompromising way to play. Nice queenside initiative, and black manages to exchange off this so-called bad bishop. In fact, this bad bishop often holds together black structure. As we'll see, that can be important. But in principle, positionally, this is a nice move because the bishop on d3 is a strong attacking piece. Harikrishna playing these moves instantly, as indeed was Studer. This had all been played before. Studer had had this position before and recaptured with the rook. But here he played queen takes instantly, so he'd obviously felt this was stronger than the move he'd played in this previous game. And Harikrishna was anticipating this. And straight away he sacrificed a pawn with f5. Now this is very typical. So Studer thought for some moments here, took it, and then an instant follow-up from Harikrishna, bishop f4. What a cool way to follow a pawn sacrifice. Not to do anything rash, but just to play a very sensible move, which perhaps prepares opening the e-file with e6, but of course makes way for the knight to head to e3, where it attacks both pawns. So just kind of straightening out, a nice little quiet move that helps to organise white's position. Now, for example, after h6, well, maybe h4. It's possible. Perhaps knight e3 first to hit these pawns, and then h4, and queen e6. This was, well, when I looked at this last night, and this was what my computer was recommending. But the queen is a reasonable blockader, but I'd rather have a knight there. Black still has to develop, and there are very interesting ideas of breaking the position open with a3, for example. Maybe even sometimes c4 is interesting, and then black feels the lack of this light square bishop. So the tension in this position is whether black can successfully develop his king side before white somehow breaks through. Studer took on c3, and I think this is very risky, because that brings the knight into the game, attacking the pawn. So this knight has to come to b6, and you can see that this queen, in this case, is rather sidelined, and suddenly black's king in the middle looks somehow a little insecure. Of course, if black can get in two moves very quickly, bishop e7 and castles, then he's probably fine. But time is precious here. I mean, white, when I was commentating yesterday live, I felt that white could already break here. For example, if this is taken, then just swing a rook across. And this feels like such a dangerous initiative. Harikrishna thought that perhaps black should close the position with f6, but somehow, well, I also think that white can get a strong initiative there. Anyway, he went a different way, a4, and I have to admit, this is incredibly dangerous. So what happens if bishop e7? Simple move to try and castle. Well, then knight b5, threatening a big fork. Rook c8 stops that, but then knight d6 check. There's a threat to check the king, to displace the king, so if castles, and now simply d takes c5, and, well, this is probably just winning for white. So that's the basic threat. So it means that black can't just develop routinely, has to do something else, and Studer, well, is consuming a lot of time over his last couple of moves, played knight d8. Now, in principle, this is a nice idea. Blockading on e6 looks positionally absolutely spot on. Also, blockades e-file, prevents any potential e6 push. Knight b5 from Harikrishna after 25 minutes thought, threatening this, sometimes threatening knight d6. So knight e6 prevents that and looks very solid. Knight g5, the initiative continues, so clearly Now the threat is to exchange and play knight c7. And black can defend against this threat in various ways. We were mainly looking at queen b7, which sort of brings the queen back into the game. But there are several ways for white to try and build an initiative. I mean, one is to play queen c2, looking at this pawn, also looking at that pawn, so knight d6 could be coming as well. Another move is queen e2, with again the idea of playing knight d6, and that would open the e-file. Another move is simply rook e1, again with knight d6 happening on the next turn. It's a terrifying initiative. Instead, Studer played queen c8, which does lend the c-pawn a little bit of protection. And now, Harikrishna came up with, I think, the move of the day. We were struggling to find something really crushing here. We were looking at, maybe queen c2, maybe rook c1, but we didn't anticipate pawn to g4. This is absolutely brilliant. And this, as we say in English, is the straw that breaks the camel's back. It tips black over the edge. Clearly, if white is able to take on f5 and get this wonderful pawn duo, then the game is over. So, well, Studer took this pawn. But let's look at a couple of other defences. So, for example, if bishop e7, then we can take here and f6. This just blows up black's position. What else have we got? Taking on g5 and takes, then the f-file is open. This is the point. Having opened the f-file, this is so nasty. And now simply rook e1. So the queen has defended f7, but there's an absolutely crushing threat of knight d6 check. So pawn takes happened. And now a very cool move indeed. Bishop e3. Threatening the pawn on f7. And if bishop e7, well, white actually shouldn't take on f7. Looks fantastic, threatening a fork here, because black has this saving move, castles kingside. It is legal. The king doesn't pass through a check. It's an incredible move. But instead of that, white should exchange here and then play bishop g5. And the king still can't castle, and, well, the threat of bishop takes and queen g5 in combination with knight d6 is just too much for black to meet. Studer played knight takes g5, bishop g5, and now rook a e1, and, well, we have a similar kind of position as we looked at before. This is just an absolutely crushing threat. Studer tried knight c8. And queen f4 was the final move of the game. So after just 24 moves, black resigned. Why? Well, okay, let's look at a random move. Black has absolutely no defense. h6, knight d6, has to be taken. King to f8. Rook slides down. Knight takes and queen f7. Obviously, other variations are possible, but that's the basic theme, and black has absolutely no defense. Well, a wonderful attacking game from Pentala Harikrishna. He prepared very sharply indeed, but Studer didn't back down, but, well, he maybe paid the price for not preparing thoroughly enough, and this initiative of Harikrishna's was absolutely superb. g4, move of the day.